The church stood on the outskirts of what used to be called Ashcroft Township, a rotted speck on the Iowa map where the cornfields ended and the wind turned cold too early each fall. Weather-beaten but intact, its white paint flaked like dry skin and the bell tower rose hollow above a roof that hadn't caved despite decades of snow. The bell itself, cast in 1848, had not rung in over 50 years. There were no cobwebs on the pulpit, no dust on the pews, and yet no one had walked through its doors since the end of the Civil War. The cemetery beside it remained empty, no stones laid, no names etched in marble, just turned earth, as if someone had dug but never buried. The silence felt deliberate, protective, as if the building breathed only when no one was watching. In April of 1866, Emma Loudon, a young clerk with the Iowa Territorial Census Bureau, was tasked with reconciling church records against newly compiled population data. It was her first assignment away from the capital, a quiet corner of state bureaucracy meant to be mindless. She traveled alone by horse cart, carrying a worn leather satchel filled with birth logs, baptismal ledgers, and death registries. But what she found at Ashcroft didn't add up. The church's records, still intact in the township archive, listed 312 baptisms between 1853 and 1865. Yet in those same 12 years, not a single burial was recorded in the region. No child death certificates, no stillborn notices, no adult deaths either. Just names at first and middle, each paired with a date and a mark beside it in red wax. A cross for some, a black circle for others. Curious and unable to let it go, Emma walked the half-mile from the municipal shack to the church alone. It was early afternoon, the skies soft with haze. The wooden doors opened too easily. The hinges had been oiled recently. The inside smelled faintly of lavender soap and scorched fabric. She stepped inside and saw them. 29 pews polished to a dull sheen, their surfaces unnaturally clean. And carved into the back of each one, right where the spine would press during prayer, was a name. The carvings weren't worn by time, they were sharp, fresh, like they'd been added only days before. She ran her fingers along one. Laura Jean Whitlock, and beneath it, etched in finer script, baptized 1859. Witnessed. There was no dust, no insects. The candles by the altar had been replaced. The cloth runner was unstained. The hymnals showed no aid, not a single frayed corner or yellowed page. But it was the bell rope that truly made her stomach turn. It had been severed halfway up the tower, the frayed end wrapped tightly in twine, coiled and tucked behind the pulpit as if someone had deliberately chosen silence. She felt watched, not by a person but by a pattern. The logic of the place was wrong. Too preserved, too tended for a chapel no one claimed. She found the vestry locked. A faint scratching sound came from behind it. She told herself it was mice. She left quickly but marked the location in her notes, filing a quiet report with the Bureau. But the report was never archived. She later learned that someone had removed it entirely, replacing her name with that of a different clerk who had died of typhoid months earlier. Emma's concern curdled into obsession. She began tracing the names carved into the pews. Laura Jean Whitlock, Andrew Ezra Bellamy, Mercy Tannick, Reuben Holt, all born within 20 miles, all baptized within the church, none buried, none recorded as living past the age of 12. Late one night she returned with a crowbar, intent on prying open the vestry door. But when she arrived, the church had changed. The air inside was colder. The pews were covered with pale linen sheets, as if the building had gone into mourning. Yet one pew was uncovered, the last row on the left. Her own name had been carved into it, imperfect but unmistakable. Emma Abigail Loudon, witnessed. There was no date, just a red wax circle. That night Emma vanished. Her horse was found tied to a post by the town well, still saddled, reins damp with dew. No one came forward to investigate. In the capital, her absence was written off as desertion. Her family was told she had fled her position, possibly to marry. But the townspeople of Ashcroft knew better. They said nothing, but they knew. The bell hadn't rung in years, not because it was broken, but because it could not ring for those who never left. The church wasn't abandoned. It was maintained, always, by hands no one had seen, for a congregation that had never aged. No one could explain the warmth of the wood, or why in the dead of winter smoke sometimes curled from the chimney in thin gray ribbons. No one spoke of the 29 names that never changed, and no one asked who cleaned the pews. They only knew that every spring more names would appear, and the bell would never ring for them. The floorboards beneath the pulpit creaked less than they should have, almost as if they had learned to stay quiet. When a pair of state archivists were sent in 1891 to catalog old church materials for preservation, they noted how unnatural the silence was, how tightly the air clung to their lungs. One of them, Harold Finch, leaned on the pulpit as he coughed and heard a hollow sound beneath his boot. When he pried up the warped board, what he found was not dust or rot, but an iron lockbox packed so tightly into the space that it took both men and a crowbar to wrench it free. Inside it was a ledger wrapped in stained muslin, the binding frayed and stitched shut with coarse black thread, like a wound refusing to reopen. Its cover bore no title, just a cross, carved into the leather with such pressure that the pages beneath had bent around the symbol, as though burdened by it. They opened the book and found no sermons, no prayers, no accounts of parish life. Instead, the pages inside were ruled with precision, rows of columns marked with names and initials, numbers paired with odd metrics, core heat, saline weight, voice tension, cervical width. There were notations beside each one, phrases like too brittle to retain purity, reject splintered under him, and voice swallowed before response. Each entry ended with either a black ink X or a crimson check mark, perfectly drawn as if made with a razor dipped in blood. The names matched those carved into the pews. But the ledger did not treat them as souls. It treated them as data, flesh measured, altered, recorded. A priest's journal written in the language of dissection. Further into the ledger, the script changed slightly, less rigid but more urgent, as if the writer's hand had begun to tremble with belief. The entries became descriptive. He had written about something he called the cleansing cycles, rituals involving copper water basins and a breathless state induced through forced submersion. Infants were placed face down, not to test their faith, but to force silence. One line read, "Noise is defiance, breath is rebellion, silence is worship." In the margins were diagrams, headless outlines of bodies with red lines drawn across vocal cords, stomachs, reproductive organs. The ledger became more than a record. It became scripture. a sacred science authored by a man who had convinced himself God preferred the quiet ones. Then came a section labeled the unvoiceable experiments. This part was stitched together from torn scraps, some pages thinner than skin, inked with what appeared to be burned ash and boiled down marrow. Thorne had logged what he called a 12-stage progression of submission, beginning with social withdrawal and ending in the extraction of the larynx. He wrote that in stage 9 the subject became psycho-spiritually clean, a state achieved only through complete vocal obedience and physical immobility. It was here the ledger introduced the term witnessing, not as passive observation but as a condition of offering. Subjects were not baptized, they were witnessed, and in being witnessed they surrendered the right to cry out. One account described a boy named Ezra, aged 7, whose voice was systematically disciplined, using heat-etched hymnals and a metal rod inserted behind the soft palate. The entry ended with a note, "Silence held. Witness successful. Pew assigned." Each method of control had been tested, refined, and recorded. Infants were not blessed but soaked in quicklime and salt brine to see which solution calmed the nervous channels. Girls were hung upside down with bells tied to their limbs. If any noise was heard from their movement, the ritual was restarted. Some were forced to mimic hymns backward under threat of drowning, to ensure they did not carry the wrong resonance of inherited sin. Thorne had believed the human voice was where sin entered and escaped. The throat was the gateway to rebellion. And so he sealed it, not once or twice, but dozens of times methodically. The ledger noted the smallest details. How many breaths before muscle collapse, which angles of cruciform binding induced the cleanest compliance, which gags prevented convulsions without rupturing the tongue. But most disturbing of all was how gently he described it. There was no rage, no hatred, only conviction. He wrote of God as an engineer, of flesh as a machine meant for worship but prone to malfunction. He believed he had been chosen to correct that malfunction, not through kindness but through calibration. One line read, "A broken clock still ticks, but a cleansed child no longer measures time. They exist in grace." He used the term grace not as forgiveness but as stillness. Death was not the goal. Death was simply a result of imperfect silence. The perfect subject, he believed, could be held in stasis indefinitely, neither dead nor alive, but preserved in stillness. This ledger, this book of slow horrors, revealed what the town had always feared but never voiced, that Reverend Elijah Thorne had never preached salvation. He had preached stillness, not of spirit but of body, of voice, of will. He had created a theology of absence, where love meant mutilation, where silence meant completion. And every pew carved, every name etched, every ritual repeated was another step in perfecting what he called the Church of the Unheard. The men who found the ledger never spoke of it again. One moved away and hanged himself 2 years later. The other was institutionalized for paranoia, having carved names into every drawer of his boarding room. The ledger was locked away by the state and marked unsuitable for public release. Yet the church remained. The pews remained. The air still sweet with lavender soap and scorched cloth. And beneath it all, beneath the pulpit floor, a newer ledger was found decades later, begun in the same hand. The writing had not stopped. The church had not been abandoned. It had only been inherited. Behind the altar of the Ashcroft Church was a stairwell hidden beneath a hinged panel disguised as a kneeling bench. The steps led not to a wine cellar or storage room, but to a narrow stone corridor that smelled of copper and brine, a place that had never known sunlight. At the end of the corridor, a heavy wooden door opened into the baptismal chamber, though what took place inside had long since departed from anything sacred. The walls were embedded with woven copper mesh laced through plaster and sealed with a gloss of soot and blood. The floor sloped inward to a stone basin roughly the size of a coffin, filled shallow with water thickened by coarse salt. Hanging from the ceiling was a lantern that never seemed to flicker, and beside it, a wooden box nailed to the wall, filled with thin sticks of beeswax wrapped in muslin cloth. These were not for lighting, they were for silencing. The letters found years later behind the pulpit were never sent. They were unsent drafts, stuffed beneath loose boards and into the crevices behind hymnals. Written by trembling hands, most were unfinished. He says the water cleanses, but I saw her scream when... One letter began before ending in a ripped corner. Another described how the infants were brought in two at a time, always naked, always quiet unless they weren't. The Reverend would place one in the basin, and if it cried before the immersion was complete, he would pinch the wax between his fingers and press it into the mouth, packing the sound away until the tiny chest stopped rising. Those who did not cry were allowed to breathe again. Sometimes. Thorne believed the sound of resistance in an infant was evidence of inherited sin, ancestral voices attempting to escape through newborn lungs. He did not kill out of rage, he muted out of purpose. Older children were tested differently. They were told to sing the doxology while kneeling in the shallow water, and electrodes, simple hooked wires, were clipped to their earlobes and wrists. When they faltered in pitch or paused too long between verses, the copper lining in the walls delivered a current so weak it would not kill, but strong enough to seize the muscles in their backs. The Reverend believed it taught the body to submit before the soul did. Those who convulsed violently were removed and recorded in the ledger as unsuitable. The suitable ones, the ones who learned to remain still, were wrapped in linen and carried upstairs, where their names were added to a pew. They never spoke again. For women, the rituals were more grotesque. They were judged by what Thorne called their soul conductivity, a fabricated term that meant nothing in Scripture but everything in his science. The method involved iron rods heated until they glowed, then inserted beneath the collarbone or against the lower spine. If the subject fainted before making a sound, they were considered closer to the divine. If they cried out, they were deemed rebellious, vessels too porous for sanctity. Thorne kept detailed records of each trial, noting the temperature at which silence broke, the angle of contact, the location of scorch marks. One letter recounted a woman named Dinah May who was restrained at the wrists and ankles, burned 21 times before passing out. When she awoke, her eyelids were gone, not torn, but removed. Thorne had written that sight interfered with spiritual reception. Dinah May lived for 4 more days, according to the letter, then was placed in the chamber one final time and never rose. None of these acts occurred in secret. They were known. Whispers passed through town like mold in wet soil, slow but clinging. Women visited the church and returned different. Children went to be baptized and came back quiet, distant, absent even when awake. The community had no words for what they felt. They told themselves it was a high calling, that God sometimes asked strange things of his shepherds. And so the silence outside the church began to mirror the silence within. No one questioned how the pews stayed polished. No one asked who cleaned the glass or why no one else ever heard the bell. The pews themselves were not seats but markers, each one a trophy of submission. A child who passed the ritual without sound was granted a nameplate, carved not by family but by Thorne's own hand. Their families were told they had been received, though few ever saw their children again. Some mothers, it's believed, were shown wax effigies dressed in their child's clothing, stuffed and posed to mimic a sleeping figure. They were told the child had gone to live among the divine choir, that they could not be brought back for worldly concerns. The mothers wept and said nothing. Some stopped speaking altogether. The town did not rise against him. It absorbed him. Reverend Thorne became a figure of unquestioned authority, not because he inspired love, but because he demanded silence. And in a town where silence had become synonymous with holiness, none dared disrupt the order. Even when the chamber began to smell, even when the stone basin overflowed with water stained a shade too dark, they said nothing. They believed the suffering was a passage, that pain was proof of transformation, that if their children did not return, it was only because they had been accepted. But the letters told another story, one that did not end in light, one where the rituals never stopped, only evolved. The ledger was updated, the rods were refined, the wax was made thinner, easier to press into infant mouths. Every death was not an accident. It was a design, a method, a trial. Thorne was not cleansing, he was sculpting. And each life he silenced became another brick in the theology he built from bone and salt and wire. The first to return was Marilla Cates. She had gone into the chapel 9 months swollen and silent, her face already hollowed by the Reverend's sermons about how the womb was a vessel for divine correction. She emerged days later holding a child who never blinked and never made a sound, its mouth sealed with a faint layer of hardened wax that she claimed was a blessing oil. Her own lips trembled, but not a word escaped them. Her husband asked no questions. The neighbors brought food but didn't linger. They watched her rock the baby on the porch at dusk, each evening slower than the last, until the child no longer moved at all. There was no funeral, no crying, just a burial at the edge of the property and a name carved into the base of a tree, not a stone. Marilla stopped speaking after that. She was seen walking into the river 6 months later, her body found days downstream, mouth still closed, arms still curled as if cradling something that wasn't there. She was not the last. By the end of 1862, 17 women had gone into Reverend Thorne's birthing chamber, none with midwives, none with kin. The rituals were said to purify both the child and the act itself. The women were told that pain was proof of worth, that a mother's scream could rupture a soul not yet shaped. They were made to labor alone, strapped to boards beside the salt basin, a copper bowl placed beneath them to collect the grief. Those who cried out were gagged with linen soaked in brine and vinegar, meant to numb the tongue and blister the throat. Some returned with their babies swaddled in silence, Others returned empty-handed with raw, scorched palms from clinging to iron restraints for too long. None could explain what had been done to them, and none dared ask. The silence that followed these births became holy. It became expected. The sound of a crying infant was no longer a comfort. It was a warning. Those who birthed outside the chapel were looked upon with quiet suspicion, their children considered flawed, unclean, resistant to grace. Mothers who lost their voices were praised for their strength. Some had their tongues clipped with shears during labor to ensure spiritual alignment. Others were cauterized beneath the chin to sever what Thorne called the temptation to name pain. He wrote in his journal that names invited rebellion, that when a mother cried out for her child, she claimed it for herself rather than for God. The perfect mother, he believed, birthed in silence and relinquished ownership the moment the child took breath. But not all children returned. For some women, the ritual ended with their blood washed from the copper basin and nothing placed in their arms. Thorne would offer scripture, vague lines about divine choice and celestial service. The women would weep, but only once home, only behind closed doors, and even then the sobs were strangled, muffled into fabric or the crook of an elbow. A scream was seen as betrayal. Even grief had to be quiet. The townspeople did not resist this doctrine. They adapted. They altered their own behavior, lowered their voices, punished their children for speaking out of turn. Boys were silenced with straps, girls shamed for humming. Music vanished, laughter thinned. The community changed not because it agreed, but because it feared that sound itself had become dangerous. No one wanted to be the one who raised a voice too loudly and invited God's disappointment. But beneath it all, something broke. A hollowing took place in the hearts of the mothers who had given birth beneath the chapel's crossbeam. Their eyes never focused quite the same again. Their hands stayed folded long after their babies had died. They moved through their days like shadows wearing skin. Some began carving names into their own walls, names that had never been spoken aloud, names of children who had been taken or returned altered. The act of carving, of leaving a trace, was their last defiance. Reverend Thorne called them purified. The town called them holy. But behind the silence was rot. Behind every woman who returned without cries was a scream that had been stolen, sealed shut by a doctrine that demanded obedience not through love, but through pain. The choir loft had always felt heavier than the rest of the church, though no one ever said it aloud. Its steps groaned louder, its air held still as if waiting. Above, the children once stood shoulder to shoulder in pale robes, lips unmoving, yet hymns echoed without flaw. Below, hidden by a panel crafted to appear as innocent floorboard, a narrow hatch led down into a space no voice had ever escaped. It was sealed tight with rusted bolts and iron latches, each one placed not to keep danger out, but to hold something monstrous in. The room beneath had no windows. No light but a single fixed lantern in the ceiling, the flame behind cloudy glass that flickered without warmth. It was there that Reverend Thorne created the most obedient forms of silence. The memoir of Eli Vance, the carpenter who built the chamber, was found buried in the wall of his granddaughter's home in 1903. Folded into a wooden box along with a lock of hair and a rolled diagram of the church's foundation. His entries described the project not as construction but as confession. He'd been paid in silver and secrecy. promised his work would serve a divine refinement of sound. What he built was not a room. It was a laboratory of restraint. The walls were layered with lead and padded with stuffed cloth soaked in melted tallow. Not a single echo returned from its surface. Screams had nowhere to go. Laughter could not travel. Words died as they left the mouth. In the center stood a chair bolted to the ground, fitted with leather cuffs worn so smooth they gleamed. Above it a rack of gags and clamps, some of them sharpened, others curved to press the tongue flat against the roof of the mouth until the nerves went still. On the shelves were jars, rows and rows, each filled with preserved fragments of tissue, tongues suspended in murky liquid carefully labeled by name, age, and date. Children mostly, a few adults. Each entry cross-referenced in a spiral-bound journal found on the altar decades later, its pages detailing what Thorne called auditory cleansing sequences. It was not enough for him to quiet the flesh. He had to dismantle its capacity to create sound entirely. One child, recorded only as Ruthie M., was tested for endurance of restraint under whispered provocation. She was kept in the chair for 3 days, her tongue pinned with copper wire while Thorne read verses beside her in hushed tones, waiting to see if her body would twitch in defiance. When she finally tried to scream, the wire severed the muscle from the base. She bled out in silence. Another Thomas R. was subjected to what Thorne labeled a dissonance incision, an experimental procedure where nerves leading to the vocal cords were isolated, scraped, and pinned. His entry concluded with a single line. Quivered for 2 minutes. Resisted final grace. Unassigned. Every experiment was recorded with the same neutral tone. No sadness, no urgency, just method. Thorne viewed speech as a contamination of the soul's frequency. To him, pain was not suffering. It was tuning. He believed every cry could be traced to a flaw in spirit, that if the physical source of noise was removed, the soul would be forced into purity. He became obsessed with mapping the invisible wires between nerves and rebellion, drawing diagrams that resembled sacred geometry twisted into anatomy. He wrote that within every voice was a seed of betrayal, and to serve God truly, one had to be emptied of the need to respond. The townspeople never knew the room existed, but they felt its effects. The children changed. The few who returned did so without memory, walking like pale ghosts with vacant eyes and mouths that opened only to breathe. Some hummed faintly, a single tone over and over, as if their bodies remembered the pain more clearly than their minds. Parents stopped asking questions. The church called it grace, but the soundproof room never stopped taking. Each child who entered left something behind. A finger, a name, a voice, a future. And at its center, Thorne listened not with ears, but with his belief. He waited for silence to mean something more than absence. He waited for the scream that never came, and when it didn't, he called it holy. The room beneath the choir was not a secret. It was a sermon written in flesh. They stood in perfect rows, unmoved by time or dust, carved with reverence and varnished with care, as if the pews themselves bore witness to something sacred. There were 29 of them, each marked with a brass plate bearing a name that no longer appeared on census records, school rosters, or church rolls. The oldest was from 1856. The newest was carved in 1865, the final year before the chapel was sealed and the bell silenced forever. The names were all inscribed in the same hand. No family had requested them. No donations had paid for them, and yet each was affixed with ritualistic precision, the script identical, as if written by a hand that refused to age. It wasn't until a structural fire inspector visited in 1892 that someone finally pried one of the plates loose, exposing what had been hidden beneath. Scratches in the grain, deep and frenzied, curled wood like fingernail shavings. In the grooves, slivers of fingernail still clung. Tiny fragments of tooth enamel, strands of hair embedded in the seam between backrest and frame. These were not pews built for worship. They were tombs for the voiceless. Reverend Thorne had written in his third ledger that resurrection required total silencing of the body before the soul could be heard. He believed that the voice itself interrupted divine transmission, that it created friction between the flesh and grace. And so he devised a doctrine in which death was not the end, but a required correction, final erasure of the human flaw. Each subject he brought through his baptismal rites, his soundproof experiments, and his ritual mutilations was eventually deemed worthy or discarded. Those who broke under pain, who cried out or trembled too violently, were recorded as lost. But those who endured, who withstood agony without speech, were said to be made still. And in the final moments of their suffering, when breath slowed and blood pooled beneath their feet, he would carry them alone through the choir loft into the nave and lay them onto the very pews they had earned. He called it their resurrection bed. But they were not laid gently. They were strapped down with leather belts and pinned beneath heavy cloth, sometimes for hours. He would whisper scripture above them, waiting until the body stopped seizing, until the lungs gave out one final slow push. Only then would he nail the plate into the backrest, sealing the soul within. He said the wood remembered. When the plates were eventually removed during state investigation, it was discovered that the grain beneath each one twisted unnaturally, as though warped by heat or pressure. Some boards appeared singed despite no record of fire. Others pulsed faintly under certain temperatures, as if reacting to sound that no longer existed. And within the wood, buried so deep that only splinters could be pulled, were remains. Tiny bone fragments pressed into the base of each bench, not haphazardly but inserted methodically. The forensic records logged the same pattern 29 times, a central incised line down the rear support beam, within which human hair and pulverized cartilage were sealed using animal glue and wax. Some had cloth fibers resembling the baptismal linens. Others bore the initials of children last seen entering the chapel for spiritual guidance. Thorne wrote in his doctrine that every death served two purposes. The first was the annihilation of the voice, the purest act of worship. The second was architectural preservation. The soul, once silenced, became a part of the structure. He believed churches were not built from timber and stone, but from stillness. He claimed the pews could retain the soul's silence, that once embedded with the remains of the purified, they could no longer rot. And he was right. Over 30 years after the church was abandoned, the pews had not cracked, not warped, not faded. They remained smooth and whole, as if time could not claim what pain had sealed. Those who sat in the pews during early revival attempts claimed they heard faint hums beneath them, like breath caught between planks. One woman fainted during prayer, later saying she felt fingers beneath her spine. Another ran screaming from the church after sitting in the 5th pew on the left. Caleb Horn, witnessed 1859, claiming she heard someone whispering scripture into her ear, though no one was near her. Officials dismissed these reports as hysteria, relics of superstition, but no one sat in the pews after that. Services were attempted with folding chairs. They failed. Nothing took hold in that space again. It became clear that Thorne's rituals had never been isolated acts of cruelty. They were building blocks. Each death was an offering not just to God but to the sanctuary itself, a transaction, life for permanence, voice for silence, pain for peace. His theology demanded not just submission but incorporation, literal absorption of the silenced body into sacred space. When questioned, surviving parishioners who remembered the ceremony said they had always wondered why Thorne spent so much time sanding the pews at night, always alone, always humming that same single note. Some said they heard crying behind the hymns. Others had seen blood on the cloths draped over the benches before sunrise. But no one ever stopped him, because every ritual was framed in grace. Every child returned to stillness was said to be chosen, and every plate nailed into the pews was spoken about in the past tense, never questioned, never revisited. By the time the 20th pew was assigned, the town had already changed. Language softened, laughter became taboo, crying was punished. Mothers taught silence before words, and in the back of every mind they feared one thing above all, that a voice once raised could never be forgiven. The 29 pews remain intact. No tools have ever removed them, no storms have broken them. They sit in rows like ribs in a cage, holding something not alive but not entirely gone. The names gleam even now, their brass darkened but never rusted. The names that once belonged to children, to wives, to sons who were never buried. Not in the ground, but in the wood, forever still, forever watched. Her name was Grace Elcott, and for years she was thought to have died with the others. One of the lost names whispered in Ashcroft only when the wind carried a hymn through the trees. But she didn't die. She survived, though not whole, not untouched. Her escape was not dramatic, not loud. It was not even noticed. And perhaps that was the only reason she lived. When she was found in 1884 wandering the woods near Jackson Hollow, she was 16, half-mute, and barely able to hold her head up without shaking. Her left cheek had fused into a hard crust of scar tissue that stretched from ear to jaw, burnt black and cracked like riverbed clay. Her mouth hung open slightly as if it had been stretched once too far and never learned how to close again. For weeks she said nothing, not because she couldn't, but because she had learned what happened when one made sound. It was only months later, under the care of a nurse named Edna Rath, that Grace began to write. Not speak. Write. Her hands trembled, her letters uneven, but the words poured out like blood from a reopened wound. She wrote in short phrases, never full sentences, always fragmented like thoughts that had once been beaten out of rhythm. She wrote of the chamber beneath the pulpit, the one few had seen and fewer had returned from. She wrote of the copper tracts, the jaw clamps, the padded floor that absorbed even the most desperate sobs. But most of all, she wrote of the moment she became something Reverend Thorne would call a failure. She was 12 when they brought her in, already quiet, already compliant. Her parents had died of fever the year before, and she had been sent to live with the Elcotts, distant cousins with strict views and gentler fists than most. The church saw her as ideal, empty of history, easy to mold. Thorne selected her for what he termed a reverberation rite, a final phase meant to produce pure godly resonance through pain converted into sound. It required electrical stimulation of the spine, copper wiring sewn into the mouth, and a vibration chamber designed to amplify suffering into harmony. She was told it would last less than an hour. She wrote that the pain started behind her eyes, then moved down into her teeth. She was strapped in place by her tongue and the base of her skull. The sound they were trying to force out of her was not natural. It was mechanical, artificial, designed. When it didn't come, Thorne increased the charge, then the heat. Her face caught fire before her voice did, but she did not scream. She choked, and then passed out. She awoke alone, discarded on the stone floor beside the baptismal basin, partially wrapped in ash-soaked cloth. Thorne had left her there, assuming the rite had failed, assuming she would not rise. But Grace had something the others didn't. She had heard the screams. She had not imagined them. Beneath the choir room, beyond the copper-lined walls, behind the organ's hollow casing, there were still children, still moving, still alive. She heard 28 voices, but not in song, not in prayer. They were raw, broken somewhere between human and something else. The voices rose and fell like sobs echoing through water. They didn't scream in words. They screamed in tones, notes that had been shaped by suffering and held too long. Grace dragged herself to the wall and pressed her face against the bricks. The mortar crumbled under her weight. She wrote that the stones were hollow. Behind them she could feel movement. Fingers brushing against the stone from the other side. She stayed there for hours, listening. She wanted to answer them, to say she was there, but she had no voice left to give. Eventually she crawled out, barefoot and burned, using the old coal chute behind the vestry to slide into the woods. No one saw her. No one followed. Her writings, collected later by Nurse Rath and compiled into a file called the Elcott Record, were deemed too hysterical for formal inquiry. The state dismissed them, said she was traumatized, possibly delusional. But the details were too specific. The copper tracks, the soundproof walls, the 33 leather restraints, the phrase harmonic obedience, scrawled on the inside of a pipe. And her burns, those couldn't be fabricated. She had been a part of something, even if no one wanted to believe it. Grace spent the rest of her life in a rural asylum under the name Mary Hollis. She never married, never left, but she wrote, pages and pages. She wrote until her fingers curled from arthritis and her scarred cheek stiffened so much she could no longer hold a pen. Her final entries were darker, less structured. One described a dream where she stood in the choir loft and saw every child she'd ever known looking up at her, their mouths open wide, but no sound coming out. Another said that the floorboards of the chapel had begun to hum again, that she could hear them from 1,000 miles away. One night she tore the sheets from her bed and carved the number 28 into the wooden wall. Not her own number, but theirs. She died quietly, no autopsy, no grave marker. But when her journal was finally reviewed decades later, it reignited the investigation into Reverend Thorne's church. Not as a place of lost faith, but as a prison, a machine, a system built on the theory that pain could be tuned like a hymn, and that those who failed to sing were simply not meant to survive. Grace Elcott was never saved. She was not healed. She was not holy. but she was the only one who came back. And in the silence she left behind, something began to tremble loose. The records were never meant to surface. For decades, they sat buried in a mislabeled storage file in a federal archive building outside St. Louis. Folders marked chaplaincy behavioral trials, 1861 to 1865. Their pages yellowed but intact, shielded by bureaucracy, forgotten under newer layers of classified ruin. But in 1973, during a sweeping declassification effort tied to Civil War correspondence and medical trials, one archivist noticed something odd. Among the military reports on troop morale, there appeared a set of transcripts written not in military language but in sermon. And each report, without exception, was signed E. Thorne, Chaplain Class B, Remote Lab 14A, Ashcroft, Iowa. What followed was a discovery that shattered any remaining illusion that Reverend Elijah Thorne had acted alone. Behind the image of a backwoods preacher with cruel convictions was something larger, something colder, something commissioned. His church, with its salt-lined pews, soundproof chambers, and mutilated children, had not merely been the cradle of personal madness. It had been a field site, an experimental model for silence as behavioral control. In one report titled Vocal Disruption as Discipline Model for Combatants, Thorne described how the human voice was not merely expression but contagion, how spoken defiance could erode military cohesion faster than wounds. His methods were outlined in clinical terms: voice isolation, resonance suppression, laryngeal recalibration through sustained trauma. He was building silence not as reverence but as a weapon. The funding trail led back to an early, unofficial subdivision of Union Army intelligence. Their goal had been crude but ambitious: to design psychological conditioning programs that could suppress panic, fear, and disobedience in battlefield environments. While other researchers tested gas, sedation, and music therapy, Thorne offered something else: permanent stillness, a state where the subject's very instinct to speak had been severed. He promised not sedation but subtraction, a body that would not shout, complain, or disobey. In the eyes of the War Department, he wasn't a priest, he was an asset. The reports were often written in code, church language substituted for field jargon. Baptisms referred to initiation trials. Witnessing meant sensory compliance. Rebirth was full vocal cessation. The government didn't care what he called it so long as the results held. And they did. Thorne provided case logs where the children who survived his methods exhibited total behavioral suppression. Their pain responses were muted, their sense of self dulled. They followed instruction without hesitation, even when physically harmed. In one document labeled Subject C-Level Thomas R., Thorne noted the subject endured a simulated whipping without a single noise. The test was deemed successful. The notes concluded: pain retained, will dissolved, vocal deterrent eliminated. In exchange for these results, Thorne was granted shipments: medical instruments, copper materials, chloroform, and surgical blades, delivered under the guise of church aid. Invoices show bulk orders of jaw stabilizers and restraint cloths, quantities that made no sense for a town of fewer than 200 people. Alongside the supplies came forms, blank death certificates, pre-signed by military medical officers to be filled in as needed. The government was not blind. It simply looked away. There is no doubt now that the sermons he delivered from the pulpit, Those soft-spoken homilies about discipline, sin, and silence were also his lab notes. Witnesses recalled him reading strange passages during service, strings of numbers hidden between verses, phrases that didn't sound biblical. 12 held, 9 rejected, 3 unresponsive. These were not spiritual reflections, they were progress reports. Each Sunday he was updating the system he served, not God but governance. The psychological impact on Thorne himself, if it could be called that, was impossible to fully assess. But patterns emerge from the reports. His language grew less clinical and more spiritual over time, as though he had come to believe the system he was serving was divine. At first, he wrote about the brain's resistance to obedience. Later, he wrote about the soul's noise as a disease. The war had given him permission, but it was belief that gave him purpose. He fused patriotism and theology into a single doctrine: obedience through mutilation, salvation through silence. He no longer saw suffering as a method. He saw it as the cure. The deaths that occurred under his authority were not merely spiritual miscalculations or accidental overdoses of doctrine. They were purposeful, procedural, and incrementally refined. Children died when they failed to suppress reflexes. Mothers bled out when they resisted sedatives. Infants were disposed of when their cries proved too loud to train. Every failure was documented, dissected, and used to improve the next method. The church was not a church. It was a machine. Even after the war ended, the payments didn't stop immediately. There are records of wire transfers as late as 1868, 3 years after the supposed closure of experimental programs. By then, Thorne had fully retreated from public view. The town no longer questioned him. The pews remained full of names no one spoke aloud. The soundproof room was still used. The choir loft remained hollow and echoing. The silence became its own kind of faith. And when federal investigators finally moved to shut it down, they found the doors unlocked, the altar bare, the rooms emptied. Thorne had vanished. No body was recovered. Only his 5th ledger was found beneath the pulpit, open to a final page that read, "God is not found in light. He is the quiet that follows when all voices are gone." What Thorne built in Ashcroft did not die with him. It was studied, archived, quietly admired. His methods, too brutal for public policy, were whispered into future models of interrogation and psychological deterrence. The government erased his name, but not his work. His silence echoed into black sites, into cold rooms where screams are not heard, into programs that still wear clean names like behavior correction and stress compliance. What began as a church became a prototype, a place where suffering was engineered, measured, and sanctioned. And at its center was not just a psychopath, but a man who believed silence could be national. A man who was paid to turn pain into order, and did. By the time the fire came, the church had already stopped pretending to be a church. The bell had long been taken down, the windows blackened with soot, not from smoke but from rot, and the door hinges grown stiff from years of disuse. No sermons were preached, no prayers whispered. But the pews remained, 29 polished rows like ribs in a beast too proud to decompose. Locals called it the Hush House. Children dared each other to approach it, parents warned them away. Not with reasons, but with warnings that held too much weight to question. Yet it was not the state that brought an end to Ashcroft Chapel. It was a girl with a box of matches and a name inherited like a scar. Clara Elcott was 17, the granddaughter of Grace, and she had grown up reading journals that no one believed were true. Clara's mother had never spoken of the church, not directly. But Clara had found pages tucked between boards in the barn, sealed in tin, boxes buried behind the well, pressed into hymnals like leaves, preserved not for beauty but for proof. She had read about the rites, the silence, the choir without breath. She had traced the names on the brass plates and found her own last name beneath the fifth pew, witnessed 1862. She understood then that her family line had not survived. It had been paused, interrupted, strangled into stillness. Grace had escaped, but only just, and no one had ever answered for it. Not the government that paid for it, not the townspeople who looked away, not the records that quietly closed their ledgers and filed the deaths under missing. Clara knew that forgetting was what evil counted on. So she remembered, and then one night in October of 1912 she set the chapel on fire. She did it slowly, deliberately. Oil poured down the center aisle into the seams between the pews, into the baptistry and the cracks along the altar base. She lit the match at the spot where the spiral staircase once descended into the soundproof chamber and waited until the flame reached the rear wall. Then she walked away. She didn't watch it burn. She didn't need to. By dawn, it was gone. The structure collapsed inward. The copper melted into black rivers across the floor. The pews turned to ash. Only the stone base of the pulpit remained, cracked but intact, as if it refused to disappear. Officials called it arson. Locals called it mercy. No one came forward to stop her. No charges were filed. What came next was quiet, but not the same kind of quiet the church had forced. It was reflective, slow, heavy. The fire had opened something. Inquiries were reopened. Unmarked graves exhumed. Names long vanished from public record were re-entered. Grace's journals, once dismissed as the ravings of a damaged mind, were now read aloud before committees. Survivors stepped forward from nearby counties bearing scars in their throats and eyes that never quite focused on the present. A story long buried had returned, and this time it was heard. The state responded with policy. In 1913, Iowa passed its first legislation requiring religious institutions to report all deaths and disappearances occurring under their care. Laws modeled in part on the Elcott files. Over time, those protections grew. By the 1970s, investigations into other sites revealed similar patterns. Silence where there should have been records, rituals where there should have been rules. In 1981, the law was renamed. Grace's law now mandates full audio surveillance in any state-sanctioned religious, educational, or therapeutic facility where children are housed or treated. It is the only law in the nation specifically designed to protect children from silence. Not noise. Silence. Still, the church was never rebuilt. The land remained empty. For decades, it was just an overgrown patch of earth with cracked foundation stones and the faint scent of iron in the soil. Locals kept their distance, and then, in 2003, on the 91st anniversary of the fire, a group of students from the University of Iowa placed a single granite memorial where the altar once stood. It was plain. No names, no dates, just one word etched in deep, unpolished letters. Listen. That word has drawn visitors every year since. Not many, but enough. People who come not to mourn, but to remember. To recognize that the worst things are not always buried. Sometimes they sit in the open, dressed in robes, reciting scripture, smiling softly. Sometimes they ask for your trust. Sometimes they offer salvation. and sometimes they tell you that pain is a path to peace. The kind of evil that lived in Ashcroft didn't wear horns or carry a knife. It wore a collar. It read from a book. It hummed hymns while it wired children into silence. Evil does not always scream. Most often it hums. It sings. It repeats. It grows behind locked doors and soft words. It tells you it's doing God's work. And when it finds a structure strong enough to hide behind, when it learns that no one wants to hear about what happens in the quiet places, it becomes permanent, revered, institutional. What Reverend Thorne built was not a church, it was a prototype. And though it burned, its blueprint remained in the systems that disregard a child's voice, in the institutions that reward silence, in the fear that questions might lead to punishment. That single granite word is not a warning. It is a command.